Okay, hello everybody. Today we are going to be covering understanding behavioral challenges in children. I am Amanda Dixon. My Margot was not able to make it today, so I will be covering this topic. So first, what we want to think about as far as behavioral challenges in children, really considering the fact that behavior speaks volumes in a variety of different ways, acknowledging that behavior on the end of caregivers, teachers, other meaningful adults in children's lives can be pretty overwhelming sometimes for those of us on the other end of those behaviors. So, really, what we're going to be talking about today is, what happens when those behavioral challenges reach a point where that challenge has reached a pivotal place where the question is this sort of normal behavior or behavioral outbursts for kids? Because there is an amount of behavioral acting out that is normal for children at different points of development. And so, really going to discuss quite a bit what are we looking for when we're thinking about how often the behaviors are happening and what is their intensity, as well as what is the age of the child. So, throughout the process of this talk tonight, we're going to cover common behavioral challenges, root causes for behaviors, warning signs, when to be concerned, strategies for support, and professional help and intervention. So some common behavioral challenges that we see for kids, and again, this we're talking about on a spectrum, right? A spectrum of what would be age appropriate, developmentally normative, versus the other end of the spectrum where it isn't meeting sort of the normal expectations for behavior. So first, I'm going to talk about defiance and oppositional behavior. So, this is commonly when we're asking a child to do something or to engage in something or go somewhere, and they're just digging their heels in, really resisting the idea of doing whatever the thing is that we're asking. And so defiance and oppositional behavior, as I'll mention, and we'll say multiple times today, occurs on a spectrum, right? So defiance and oppositional behavior, to some extent, are normal, right? I think the question that we want to ask as caregivers for any of these things that I'm going to talk about is, how much is it impacting the functioning of the child? And how much is it impacting the functioning of the system, meaning the family, and or the child and caregiver, right? If that's the system. Next, we see aggression or physical outbursts, right? So is there this level of intensity, potentially in anger, that leads to aggression, physically acting out? Of course, if we're on the sort of end of the spectrum where we likely elicit concern, hopefully before this, but really where the concern would come into play, where hopefully we're questioning, hey, can I get some additional support? Does this child, would they benefit from counseling? Is if, the physical outbursts results in physical aggression towards themselves or towards other people. One other thing that I think is important to acknowledge, which we'll talk more about soon, is aside from thinking about how all behavior is communication, really also considering what emotions might be behind this behavior for my child. Because sometimes if we are able, and this sometimes takes a lot of work for us as caregivers, because sometimes these behavioral challenges, big intense emotions from our kids can be triggering for us. And I totally get that. I'm a parent also, and sometimes some of the things that happen with my kids, because we're all human, are very triggering for me. So if we can enter into these situations as much as we can with a level head, feeling as calm and collected as we can, that is only going to help. That's like money in the bank for these situations, to help be able to diffuse some of those big emotions that our child might be feeling. So if we can help diffuse some of that, right, the hope is that that helps to lessen some of these behavioral challenges. Obviously, if we are trying, all of these things, we're really working hard, and it still feels like we're up against such oppositional behavior, aggression, physical outburst, then that's a point where we may want to ask, like, okay, or think about the fact that I've tried kind of all of the tools in my toolbox. Maybe it is time to get some additional support with this. Another behavioral challenge that we may see is social withdrawal, right? Kids and or teens who disengage from activities, right? And this is often especially concerning for children, but especially concerning also in adolescents. Some of this, again, is normative for adolescents as well, as far as like social withdrawal from family systems, being more driven to spending time with friends. But again, we're still looking at this on a spectrum. So for teens, yes, there may be some system withdrawal from families, desire to want to spend time still with friends, but still some interest or need to spend time with family or want family input. And even if I'll go out on a limb here or like highlight this piece, is even if it seems like that our teens don't want any of our input or connection, there is still sort of a basic need there of having some connection to a meaningful caregiver, because out in the world, right, they aren't, as a teenager, aren't meant to really be able to navigate everything themselves without some kind of adult guidance input. Obviously, that doesn't necessarily have to be a parent. That could be a teacher. That could be a coach. But what the important piece is that there is still some mentor there, essentially. But we're really looking at kind of going back to the point of social withdrawal. What does that look like, right? Is our child or teen disengaging from activities that they once found fun or interesting, that that they really derive some joy from? Impulsivity is another one, right, where we just see, and again, age appropriate at different points, right? For younger kids, absolutely much more impulsivity, still impulsivity through adolescence. It's going to look different, certainly, than the impulsivity of a 4-year-old, but the impulsivity is still a part of the developmental scheme until like the mid-2020s. Because obviously we do now know that the brain, actually not even mid-20s, but late 20s, the brain doesn't stop developing really until the late 20s. And so impulsivity being a part of all of that trajectory. But when we're thinking about impulsivity for kids or teens, it really comes back to safety, functioning, right? So is this child putting themselves in unsafe situations? Is this teen putting themselves into unsafe situations due to some of this impulsivity that they're struggling with or exhibiting? If it's impulsivity as far as like, oh, I can't, again, as a 4 or 5-year-old, I can't wait my turn, that's normative, right? That is going to hopefully, as that child gets older, shift and change, because sort of the social norms with peers are going to force that into shifting and changing, where the child's going to have to learn through either natural consequences, things that have happened again through social interaction, that I have to wait my turn. Otherwise, other people frustrated at me, don't want to be my friend, right? And so there's some of that self-correcting that happens. Obviously, we're seeing shifts and changes in impulsivity where developmentally we would expect sort of the impulsivity to get better with age or look different with age, and it seems like it's worsening. Again, that's sort of a point where we want to question, okay, does the change in impulsivity make sense, right? So for example, if that child has gone through something really hard, something traumatic, has really like a parental divorce, really kind of struggling with some of the changes that have come along with that, we may see some of all of these different behavioral challenges increase. So, and like I said, we're going to talk more next about sort of the root causes for why we may see shifts and changes in behavior. And then finally, tantrums beyond expected developmental age. So tantrums are normative. Again, we're looking at intensity, age of the child, and how often are they happening. Again, tantrums for a 3.5, 4-year-old, normal. Big emotions at different points. We could maybe, some people may label them tantrums, big emotions sort of throughout the developmental trajectory of being a kid into being a teenager, somewhat normative, right? Sometimes occasional big emotions, typically shorter lasting. If they're longer lasting, occurring more frequently, and aren't really aligning with the developmental stage where that child's at, that's helpful information. So the root causes, right? So what do we want to ask ourselves about when we are noticing shifts in our child's behavior, and shifts in our child's behavior that make it more problematic, again, for us to be able to function as a family or for our child to be able to function. So as I've already mentioned, developmentally, right, stages and levels of immaturity at different stages are going to impact some of those behaviors that I've already mentioned. We want to look at environmental stressors. This is really important. Is there family conflict, trauma, adverse childhood experiences? Going back to my point about how, oftentimes it's big emotions underneath behavior, and that behavior is really trying to communicate an unmet need. At times, those big emotions can be triggered by these environmental stressors and things sometimes that even as caregivers, we aren't fully aware of, right? So I'll give an example, right? So sometimes for our kids, what might be really a big, hard thing for them, for us as a caregiver or as an adult, we may not consider as being such a big deal. For example, let's say, we're moving houses, our child's going to stay in the same district, really going to be a better move, like bigger house, just better location. Child's, let's say, 8 years old, 9 years old. For us, we may be thinking, oh yeah, like about all of the great things that this is going to bring, and not understand like why our child might be having a hard time with some of this for them, right? So some of the pieces that might be coming up for them that they're either aware of or unaware of is really struggling with the fact that this is a transition, and transitions can be often hard for kids. It's a big transition. Even though, right, we're keeping same school district, maybe that kid has a lot of friends in the neighborhood where we lived before. And so just to kind of highlight, right, for kids often, these smaller things, or things that we as adults may not see as sort of big deals, for kids can be very big deals. And so all that to say, sometimes we may see behavior that's trying to communicate emotion, trying to communicate loss, really hard things. And as a caregiver, we might be missing what it is that could have been a stressor that's really impacting our child. And so, really, I guess sort of what my encouragement is just the consideration around those things that maybe, again, we wouldn't have considered. Let's say we got into a minor car accident. Nobody was injured. Everything was fine. It was a slight bender. That might have been really overwhelming for our child's system, and may then impact kind of their feelings, ability to cope, and behaviors following. So really these things that, again, as adults, we have the narrative, the cognitive ability, and the coping skills to be like, okay, that happened, that was over, everybody's safe, all of these pieces that we can kind of maybe move on. Whereas for kids not having all of those pieces that really help to move forward with things. Root cause of behavioral challenges might be learning disabilities, right? So if there's a struggle to understand their world, understand the expectations, understand how to read, figuring out how to read and write, where all other kids in their classes are reading and writing, and they're really struggling academically day in and day out. There could be behaviors associated with that, because that may be bringing up a sense of shame for them, a sense of overwhelm, a sense of all of these sort of negative thoughts that they might be having about themselves and how they're not. Like, why can't they get this? Why are they not good enough? Neurodevelopmental disorders, right? So ADHD, ASD, to name a couple. So with these disorders, right, the brain working differently. And so the brain really being able then to have its own kind of superpowers in some ways, and then also some things that are a bit more challenging, right? Potentially to be able, and I'll use ASD as an example, so autism spectrum disorder, potentially like for a child, maybe a little bit more, some more rigidity around transitions and around change. So that example I gave before of moving, right, within the same neighborhood, that change that, again, as an adult, we're like, ooh, this will be good. This will, it'll be good for everybody. For that child specifically with ASD, may be very, very overwhelming for them, and may result in, again, exhibiting behaviors because they don't know what to do with that information. They know that they're not feeling good sort of about this change or the potential for this change. And again, their system just doesn't know what to do with it. And then finally, inconsistent parenting or discipline. So, right, we may see changes in behavior or increase in behavioral intensity if we aren't consistent in the way that we're parenting. And this is true like from caregiver to caregiver. So especially in situations where parents are separated or divorced, the consistency in parenting becomes a bit more challenging. And sometimes that can be, aside from already the transition and change for that child, sort of the inconsistency and differences in parenting can also add to that. Obviously, inconsistent parenting and discipline can happen in intact families as well. So really, there's just that idea of how, regardless of whether we're an intact family or a divorced or separated family, how as caregivers can we try to get on the same page, which can be very hard for parents at times and caregivers at times, because very different perspectives and viewpoints on how parenting should happen and how caregiving should happen, what our approaches are, how we were parented, right? All of these things play into how we're showing up for our kids. And sometimes, right, also the acknowledgement as caregivers that we're human as well, right? So maybe going through a season of our life that's particularly difficult, struggling with depression, anxiety, loss of our own parent, right? Like just these things that may result in also being inconsistent. And so the consideration for those things, right? Those things that that may impact how we're able to show up for our kids in the caregiving way. So some of what I've already mentioned, but going to highlight here some warning signs, right? We're really looking for, it's not a one-off situation or even infrequent. We're looking really for persistent patterns over time, persistent patterns of real challenge where the intensity is such that it's pretty unmanageable for the child and or the caregivers. We see disruption at home, school, or other social settings. As I've already mentioned, how is it impacting the system of the family? How is it impacting the child's ability to function at home, at school, in other situations? And if the disruption is such that it's really impacting either one or all of these, right? What do we then do about it? And how do we help support that child in a different way? Do we start kind of at home and shifting how we are parenting and caregiving? Do we pull in outside support? Extreme emotional responses to minor events. So, right, the example that, okay, it might be what seems like something that wouldn't be a big deal, right? That our child isn't able, like started to do an art project and messes something up and doesn't bounce, like maybe historically has been able to bounce back pretty quickly, been able to take that mistake and kind of move on. And then so like over time that has shifted where there really isn't that ability to move on, to accept mistakes, to be flexible. And so that there's this extreme response to that challenge and difficulty. And again, looks different potentially than it had previously. We may see trouble forming or keeping relationships, which kind of makes sense because in the scheme of things, right, like when there are big behaviors, they sometimes can keep people at a distance or make people feel a lack of safety. And so that can impact our child's ability to feel connected to other kids because the behaviors are getting in the way, because the behaviors are keeping other people at a distance. And again, those behaviors, kind of going back to what I am going to continue to hone in on, are trying to communicate something, trying to communicate an unmet need, trying to communicate big feelings. And so if we can really try to work to uncover what's underneath of those behaviors, that's really going to help with the lessening of those behaviors over time. And right, going back to this idea of keeping and forming relationships, going to help our child feel more connected to people because the behaviors aren't getting in the way. We may see some difficulty following directions or rules, right? A struggle with, really, and again, when this is a persistent pattern, ask to do something, does not follow through, can't do it, has a breakdown, or really gets aggressive, that is a potential warning sign where we're not really able to enlist the help of our child in, let's say, doing chores right around the house. That becomes a big fight all the time. And again, some of that, small doses, normative. I don't really, I mean, I can speak for my kids. They don't love chores, but it's a part of life, right? And so we talk about how this is just part of what we do and have a responsibility as a family to do these things to keep our spaces clean or in order. But when we're seeing, this sort of setting that expectation as a family and one of our kids can never follow through with doing what we're asking, and not just not follow through, but follow through where there's these big intense emotions that keep kind of everybody at bay. And granted, we can acknowledge, like, in some ways, the behaviors will help keep us at bay, and that's actually a function then too, or can be a function of, like, knowing that there aren't going to be expectations placed on them, maybe again in the future. And again, some of this may not be conscious either, right? So going through this process of exhibiting these big emotion or big, behaviors that are coming from an emotional place, functions then to not be asked to do chores again in the future, potentially, because it's easier to not try to disturb things, right? And know that there's going to be an outburst. So, in those situations, we're finding, like, that there's then kind of reinforcement of pulling back in our caregiving style, when the expectations really are age appropriate, developmentally appropriate, things that really are necessary to, like, move forward with functioning in life, really could be important to get some additional support. So when to be concerned, when the behavior persists for more than 6 months. So duration, how long has this been going on? It impairs academic or social functioning, as I've already mentioned, right? So how is this impairing the child's ability to function in the world? Unresponsive to typical parenting strategies, right? So if we're trying to utilize sort of the tools that we have in our toolbox as a parent that historically have worked with our other kids, or, that we really have tried to kind of learn different ways of doing better as a caregiver and trying different things, and still none of those things are working, then yes, like, potentially thinking about additional support. We see co-occurrence with anxiety, depression, or self-harm, right? So there's this social withdrawal, these big emotional outbursts and behaviors. Going back to the piece that I'd mentioned earlier, concern for safety, right? Concern that they are going to hurt themselves or hurt other people. Really taking that into consideration and ensuring that we're getting some additional support for our child. So some of the strategies that we can enlist before we pull in professional help, or with the combination of professional help, is really trying to create consistent routines and expectations, right? Being clear in what our communication and rules are, how we expect sort of our child or teen to show up and what to do, and how we are going to communicate what the expectations are. What are the boundaries within the context of the family system? We're offering positive reinforcement for good behavior. So when we are seeing things that are happening that are good and positive, that we're going to make light of that. We're going to comment on it. We're going to reward that in what ways we can, that are right for us and right for our family. And I would say, actually, for this, the positive reinforcement for good behavior, especially when our kids are really struggling behaviorally, we want to try to find any glimmers, because the more that we can highlight anything that is going well, even if it seems like a stretch, the more that is going to help both us to integrate in some ways the fact that, like, oh, some good and or okay things are still happening, and also going to be helpful for our child to hear those things, because, right, those big behaviors and big emotions often have a way of, like, just sucking the air out of the room and becoming the sole focus often of a lot of things that are happening within the family system. And sometimes that's warranted, Sometimes that isn't. Sometimes, again, that reinforces just this idea of like, okay, in order to kind of shift how things are going here, um, the sort of an outburst happens, and that like keeps everybody away from me. Again, whether that's intentional or not, likely often not intentional. Um, but the idea that we really want to focus then in on what is going well, what has been going well, because the more we can do that, the more that's going to hopefully, not meaning that we're going to ignore big behaviors and big emotions, but we're really trying to put just as much emotional energy into the things that are going well, as the things that are not going well and that are really, really hard. We want to work on teaching emotional regulation skills if we can. So this is going back to that piece of being able to be regulated ourselves. Can we check in with ourselves and acknowledge, okay, where am I at right now? Am I the right person to sort of move into trying to support my child in this moment? Is my partner? Is somebody else? Do I need to take some time to get more regulated before I can move into kind of trying to navigate supporting them with their big feelings? So we're going to model how we're handling our own emotions, and then trying to teach emotional regulation skills, not at the time when our child is struggling with big emotions, because it's not going to help. That's not going to work. Because often when there are these big emotions that are happening that lead to big behaviors, the brain, like the part of the brain that actively can learn these skills, is offline, because the nervous system really is at the forefront of like protection in that moment of like, ooh, on alert. Okay, I've got to be on alert. I am so overwhelmed. My system is so overwhelmed that part of the brain that really is conscious for making like good decisions, for really thinking things through, for being able to learn things, it's not happening. And this is why, right, which I think is an important piece to highlight for caregiving and parenting, is if our child is still really struggling with big behaviors and big emotions, really don't want to ask a lot of questions of them. They're not in their right mind. They're not in the mind of like being able to really answer, to process, to give feedback, or really understand what happened or where things are at for them. We really need to wait until like everything feels calm, time has passed. And then, yeah, can we have a conversation in a calm way, potentially that could be a learning experience? Yes. But in that moment, with the big behaviors and big emotions, that is not the time. The time then is really to model, enter into it with a calm demeanor, being able to be present. If our child likes like physical touch, right? If they want to hug or want to hold our hands, some kids don't like that, right? So it also comes back to having a sense, obviously, of what has worked for our child, who our child is, and trying to lean into some of those nuances of things that we know have been helpful in calming them in the past. And if we don't have a sense of that, we're really trying to learn over time by trying some different things out with them. Maybe maybe we bring them a cold drink. Maybe, we say, hey, like, and again, every child's going to be different. Let's go sit outside. Let's go for a walk, right? Let's count to 10. Let's focus on things that are green around the room. Right? A lot of different ways this can look, but the idea is that we really want to try to help bring them back, right? Bring them back from that place where they are no longer in their right mind, the ability really to do all those things that I mentioned. Bring them back there, bring them back into that place. And the way that we're going to do that is through touch, connection, not through communication, not through talking, trying to ask questions, get a sense of what's going on. That likely is going to escalate things. And so really thinking about kind of, are there things that we can do to kind of remove ourselves from the situation, to change the environment, to uh, help help their nervous system re-regulate. And cold water actually is a really really good thing for that. So like drinking ice cold water is actually one of the skills in DBT therapy that is recommended, because it really can help hit the vagus nerve in the back of the throat and be able to assist in regulating our emotions. And then finally, collaborating with teachers and counselors, right? The more people that we can pull into, like, onto our team during these hard times that our child are having, the more helpful that often is. Because as a caregiver, when we are trying to support a child who is having big behaviors and big emotions and having them pretty consistently, it is helpful to have other people who can shoulder some of that stress and weight, and recognizing the relationships that our child might have with these people will be different, certainly, than the relationship we have with them, but helping to share some of that weight, some of getting some support elsewhere, and being able to try to work more as a team during these harder times. I mean, in general, working as a team, but especially really important during the harder times that our kids are going through. As I've mentioned, right, like being able to seek professional help and intervention. So enlisting pediatricians, therapists, school psychologists, school counselors, pulling people in. Also, not only, like I just mentioned, collaborating with teachers and counselors, but considering, okay, do I need to obtain more support from other clinicians and people in the community or in my child's life, like a pediatrician, who would have more knowledge, right, about a child's mental health, and kind of what, as a caregiver, we can do next, what would be helpful. We can look into therapy, right? So CBT therapy, play therapy, parent-child interaction therapy, just to name a few. I think that therapy in general for kids can be really beneficial. I know that there are some people out there who have very differing views that, like, therapy isn't helpful for kids, but I've absolutely seen it be helpful for children, because again, we're working on and through a variety of different ways. I primarily, utilize play therapy because I'm a play therapist, but utilize other things as well. And what I find is, because kids are able to play through, since that's their language, play through big emotions, play through hard things in a distance way, it really helps decrease or eliminate the behaviors. We can look into individualized education plans or 504 plans, especially if, if those behaviors are occurring at school. And then in some cases, medication, right? Let's say we've tried all of the things that I've mentioned today. We really have done everything that we can. Potentially is medication a route that we would want to look at. And I think, again, what it comes down to, certainly everybody having their own opinions on medication, but what it comes down to in all of these things is coming back to what is the functioning of our child, how are they feeling, right, in their life, in who they are, in their connections to people, right? And if they're really struggling, like, exhausting sort of any option that could exist out there to help support them better and more effectively. So that's it for me. Thank you for listening, and we will be back in May.